Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Bai Xiaochun lay there in the courtyard, filled with that obsessiveness of his. His body ached, and yet somehow he could tell that his skin was tougher than before. That made him look forward more than ever to becoming an apothecary. After laying there in the courtyard for more than an hour, the shaky, painful feeling eventually faded away. Bai Xiaochun crawled into a cross-legged position, eyes flickering as he patted his bag of holding to produce the medicinal pills and medicinal incense. After closer inspection, he took a deep breath, looked around furtively, then headed back into the log cabin, where he once again took out the turtle walk. I could consume this medicinal pill as is. But after I do a spirit enhancement, it should be able to break my cultivation base through from the 3rd level of chi condensation to the 4th. It's too bad that 2-colored firewood is so expensive. The ovens has some, but I'm not longer a servant there anymore, which makes things complicated. Bai Xiaochun's excitement regarding the medicinal pill continued to grow. After a bit of thought, he ceased any hesitation and produced a piece of 1-colored firewood. I'll just do a basic enhancement. That'll be good enough. He quickly lit the firewood, and the resulting 1-colored flame caused the first turtle walk design to light up. He opened the medicinal pill bottle and poured out the 3 medicinal pills it contained, all of which were as large as longan fruits. After performing 3 spirit enhancements, flickering silver designs could be seen on the surface of the medicinal pills. He also enhanced the green incense. In the end, he sat there looking at the 4 different spirit medicines upon which he had performed a basic enhancement. Finally, he placed the incense stick in front of him and then popped the 3 medicinal pills into his mouth. Then he examined the pictures in the Violet Chi Cauldron Control Art Manual, and followed the mnemonics as he began to practice cultivation. Soon, the spiritual energy in his body was seething. He could now maintain the posture for much longer than before, and he could feel his cultivation base rising rapidly. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, the little river of spiritual energy inside of him was flowing through his body, and he could sense that he was nearing a breakthrough to the 4th level of chi condensation. I just need to hold on for 100 breaths of time, and I can break through. He gritted his teeth as he continued to maintain the posture in the 4th picture. His body was swelling up so much that he felt like a ball, and cracking sounds could be heard inside of him. Great beads of sweat were rolling off of him. It was at this point that the spiritual energy began to wane. Bai Xiaochun's eyes narrowed in concentration, and he blew a mouthful of spiritual energy onto the green incense stick in front of him. As soon as the spiritual energy touched the green incense, it lit up, causing tendrils of green smoke to swirl about like green snakes. They flew through the air, entering into Bai Xiaochun's eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and then turning into strong spiritual energy. Within moments, the river of spiritual energy inside of him had doubled in size. Rumbling could be heard as a wind-like shockwave rolled out from Bai Xiaochun, spreading out through the cabin and then into the courtyard. His eyes opened, and they shone with pleasure. The 4th level of chi condensation, he exclaimed, laughing. He could immediately sense the spiritual energy surging through him, carrying with it a strong life force. He felt more agile, and when he looked down, he saw black filth caked all over his body. That would be the impurities within his body that had just been forced out. His body flickered as he floated out of the log cabin. After tidying up the courtyard a bit, he stood there feeling very energized. He quickly performed an incantation gesture and waved his finger, causing his wooden sword to fly out of his bag of holding in a streak of light. He sent it flying back and forth, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The wooden sword was already extraordinary, but now that it was combined with the cultivation base of the 4th level of chi condensation, it possessed an even more striking air. Spirit enhancement is pretty awesome. It would be great if I could use a 3-colored flame, though. A medicinal pill like that would be incredible. The more he thought about it, the more miraculous spirit medicine seemed to be. Regardless of whether it was in pill form or incense form, it was definitely an absolute necessity for practicing cultivation. I'm definitely going to become an amazing apothecary. I'll concoct a live forever never die pill. Then I'll enhance it tenfold, no, wait, I'll enhance it 100-fold. Bai Xiaochun's desire to become an apothecary was growing stronger. Suddenly, he slapped his bag of holding to produce a jade slip. It was none other than the jade slip given him by Hu Yunfei when they had gone to the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion together. Inside were images of 10,000 types of plants and vegetation. Only fragrant Cloud Peak had ancient records of this type, and they were something that all apprentice apothecaries had to master. Of course, a mere 10,000 types of plants and vegetation was only the beginning. According to Hu Yunfei, after memorizing those, you could acquire another volume. With a look of resolve, he circulated his spiritual energy, and images of various types of plants and vegetation rose up in his mind. He was filled with a strange feeling, as if a whole new page of life had opened up in front of him. There were even descriptions of the medicinal plants needed to trade for an age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill. After examining the contents of the jade slip, he realized that memorizing each of the 10,000 items wouldn't really be that difficult. However, he wasn't just any old person. His goal was to become a great apothecary who could concoct a live forever never die pill. The vicious determination concealed in his personality once again exploded out. This was not just memorizing a simple list, he had to carefully observe all of the details of each type of medicinal plant. Only after understanding a plant fully could he move on to the next one. Back when he had been under such pressure because of Shu Baosai, he had practiced cultivation like mad for the better part of half a year. Now, with even grander aspirations, a similar thing was occurring. He studied the medicinal plants down to the tiniest detail, until he could close his eyes and recall an image of each and every one. However, he still felt as if that wasn't enough, and wished he could study the actual items to make his research complete. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about that. All he could do was carefully research what he had at his disposal, which included the shapes of the leaves and the patterns of the veins. Even that wasn't enough for Bai Xiaochun though. He also studied the roots and the fruits. It was almost as if the plants themselves were right in front of him, several times their normal size and dug up out of the ground for him to study. After that, he still didn't feel confident enough. Next, he studied the tiny hairs growing on the plants, and even the tiny pore-like openings beneath them. Time passed. Soon, a month had gone by. During that time, he spent time every day practicing the 4th level of the Violet Chi Cauldron control art, and was getting much more comfortable with his cultivation base. At the same time, he hadn't forgotten about the undying live forever technique. Every day, he endured the pain as he ran around his courtyard practicing it, simultaneously memorizing the plants and vegetation from the jade slip. Unfortunately, the jade slip had no table of contents, so he wasn't sure exactly how many he had memorized so far. In addition to exercising in his courtyard, he would often stop by the spirit field in the corner, where he was growing 10 medicinal plants. These 10 plants were spirit winter bamboo. He had gone to Fragrant Cloud Peak's outer sect disciple mission steal half a month before and selected a simple, non-dangerous mission to get them. Bai Xiaochun didn't dare to forget what Li Qinghao had told him. Sect disciples needed to complete at least one mission every half year. It was a sect rule that Bai Xiaochun had kept firmly planted in mind. The merit point reward for this mission was significant, and could actually be even higher depending on how many goods were turned in at the end. It was a simple mission, but required quite a bit of time wastage. He had to care for the plants for 3 months before he could hand the mission in. Of course, the spirit winter bamboo could be catalyzed by a cultivator's spiritual energy, which would make it grow faster. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun had no time to test that method, and had simply planted the seeds in his spirit field as soon as he had gotten back. "You grow so slowly," he said, looking down at the spirit field. From the description in the jade slip, he knew that spirit winter bamboo required a lot of spiritual energy to grow properly. If the soil it was growing in didn't have strong spiritual energy, then the cultivator would need to add spiritual energy personally. He squatted down and picked up a handful of soil from the spirit field. After a moment, he muttered, "I bet this spirit field doesn't have enough spiritual energy, and that's why the spirit winter bamboo is growing so slowly. What can I do to get the spirit field's spiritual energy to be a bit stronger?" After a moment of thought, his expression lit up, and he extended his right hand, within which materialized the turtle walk. He looked at the walk, and then back at the spirit field, and his eyes began to shine. "If this walk can enhance anything, then I should be able to perform a spirit enhancement on the spirit soil, right?" Feeling very curious all of a sudden, he quickly dug up the spirit winter bamboo seeds, then filled the turtle walk with spirit soil and produced a piece of one-colored firewood to perform a test. Soon, silver light flashed, and the spirit soil in the turtle walk glowed with the design of a basic spirit enhancement. The light quickly faded, but the spirit soil clearly emanated a much stronger spiritual energy than before. Bai Xiaochun was delighted. Not feeling the slightest bit inconvenienced whatsoever, he quickly began to enhance one wokeful of spirit soil after another. After more than an hour had passed, when he was just about out of one colored firewood, the entire spirit field had benefited from a basic spirit enhancement. Of course, that was only the top level of soil. He didn't have enough firewood to go any lower. Therefore, because there was no foundation for the spirit soil, after enough time passed, it would gradually return to normal. Even so, the current spiritual energy in the spirit field had undergone a heaven-shaking, earth-toppling transformation, and was so strong that it caused a fragrant aroma to swirl about. Bai Xiaochun immediately planted the spirit winter bamboo seeds again, then stood off to the side watching. It didn't take long before some tiny buds popped up and began to grow rapidly. In the blink of an eye, they were almost a meter tall. In fact, if disciples in the sect who were adept at growing medicinal plants saw what was happening, they would certainly gasp. Even if a cultivator skillfully nourished the plants with spiritual energy, they wouldn't grow so fast. After all, no one in the cultivation world had ever been so extravagant as to perform spirit enhancement on soil, all for the purpose of growing 10 stalks of spirit winter bamboo. Not even the famous grandmasters of spirit enhancement would ever think to do such a thing. It was simply far too much of a waste. Seeing that the spirit winter bamboo was now growing well, Bai Xiaochun felt very pleased. He turned back and continued to jog around the courtyard, simultaneously studying the plants and vegetation in the jade slip. The sun was setting, and the sky grew dark. Considering that the stalks of spirit winter bamboo had already grown higher than a meter, and had apparently still not reached its full height, it was hard to say exactly how tall they would be in 3 months. That night, Bai Xiaochun finally put the jade slip down. After vicious hard work, he had finally thoroughly memorized all 10,000 types of plants and vegetation. He had even found some areas in the descriptions of the medicinal plants that revealed how they conflicted with other medicinal plants. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to go get the second volume about plants and vegetation. I wonder what the test at the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion will be like. Can I really pass it? Bai Xiaochun set his chin and flicked his sleeve. He had just been planning on uttering some bold and audacious words, but then, just couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. Clearing his throat, he picked up the jade slip again and began to study some more. He just couldn't shake the fear that some problem would come up in the test. The next morning at dawn, Bai Xiaochun woke up early. As soon as he walked out of his log cabin, he looked over at the spirit winter bamboo and saw that it was already taller than half the height of an average person. He nodded his head in satisfaction, then left the courtyard and headed in the direction of the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion. The sun rose up over the horizon, sending scintillating beams of light out in all directions. The multicolored sunlight dancing among the mists like golden carps was a truly spectacular sight. Bai Xiaochun was currently hurrying along a path along with numerous other outer sect disciples. He didn't recognize any of them, which caused him to suddenly miss his elder brothers from the ovens. I wonder how eldest brother is doing, and third fatty hey. Sighing inwardly, he walked along for about an hour, until the sun was high in the sky. Finally, he saw the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion off in the distance, and the 10 shocking stone stels set up outside of it. Those stone stels were the identifying feature of the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion. Green light emanated off of them, rising 100 or more meters up into the air. It was an amazing sight, like 10 giants standing there, completely intimidating. Visible on the surface of the stone stels were lines of text, a ranking system that went from 1 to 100. Toward the top, there were no names, only various images, which were in fact the insignias of various outer sect chosen who had become famous apothecaries in the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion. Every apothecary had a unique insignia which they would use to mark the satisfactory spirit medicines they had concocted. It was a tradition that went back throughout the ages, and therefore, it was an important honor to all apothecaries. The last time he had come here, Hu Yunfei had explained all of these things briefly. But now that Bai Xiaochun was coming here alone, he couldn't help but stare at the 10 stone stels. The first thing that caught his attention was the eye-catching insignia on the first place position of the foremost stone stele. It was a magic bottle. 1. According to Hu Yunfei, that magic bottle was the insignia of Zhou Xinqi. The name was not unfamiliar to Bai Xiaochun. Back when he was a servant, he remembered sitting under the moonlight once as Big Fatty Zhang munched on a ginseng rootlet and sighed about Zhou Xinqi. She came from a clan of mortals, and several years ago had been discovered by one of the senior members of the sect, who sensed that she had unusual latent talent. When she arrived in the sect and was formally tested, her latent talent caused a huge commotion in the spirit stream sect. She had a rare plant and vegetation spirit meridian, which not only made her speed of cultivation many times greater than the average person, but also gave her astonishing potential when it came to concocting medicine. After joining Fragrant Cloud Peak, she became Li Qinghao's only apprentice, and was actually viewed as the most important apothecary next to Li Qinghao, and a future pillar of the sect. According to the rules of the Spirit Stream sect, it didn't matter how high a person's latent talent was, they couldn't automatically become an inner sect disciple. Therefore, Zhou Xinqi was just like all the other chosen from the other mountain peaks on the south bank. They all started out as disciples in the outer sect, where they trained hard to improve. However, the cultivation resources they had access to were actually provided by the inner sect. Everyone knew that it wouldn't be long before Zhou Xinqi would prove herself and become an inner sect disciple. On top of all that, she was astonishingly beautiful, which earned her the wide admiration of countless male disciples. Because of all of these reasons, she was very famous on Fragrant Cloud Peak. In fact, the inner sect disciples didn't view her as belonging to the outer sect. Even the conservative inner sect as a whole feared her. As Bai Xiaochun considered all these matters, he suddenly felt very curious about Zhou Xinqi. Then he made his way from one stone stele to the next, closely looking at all 10. Soon, he was virtually struck speechless. Zhou Xinqi is amazing. Of these 10 stone steles, her name is in first place on 8. I don't see her name at all on the other 2, presumably she hasn't competed for those yet. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were as wide as saucers as he looked at all the stone steles. By now, the crowd of disciples that had gathered around the 10,000 medicines pavilion had swelled to quite a number. Bai Xiaochun looked away from the stone steles and found the location where he could exchange his jade slip for the second volume of Plants and Vegetation. As he looked around, he realized that there really were a lot of people present, almost as if they were gathering in advance for some reason. Suddenly, he heard people talking excitedly. Elder Sister Zhou is coming. Ha ha ha, so the rumors were true. Elder Sister Zhou is coming today. We didn't come in vain. Elder Sister Zhou has already taken first place in the 5 volumes of Plants and Vegetation and 3 volumes of Spirit Creatures. This time she'll definitely challenge the 4th volume of Spirit Creatures. The buzz of conversation rose and fell, and the crowd grew more packed. Bai Xiaochun was stuck in the very middle, but thankfully he wasn't as fat as he had been before. After jostling around a bit, he managed to get out in front. Just as he did, he looked up and saw a bright beam of light flying through the air. It was blue flying silk, standing atop which was a young woman wearing the clothing of the outer sect. Long black hair flew behind her in the wind, she had narrow, phoenix-like eyebrows and eyes that shone as cold as the moon. Her complexion was lovely, her frame thin and lithe. As she flew toward one of the 10 stone steles, a cheer rose up from the surrounding outer sect disciples. She landed and, without even glancing around, headed directly toward one of the log cabins erected beneath the stone steles. It was only at this point that Bai Xiaochun noticed that all 10 of the stone steles had log cabins beneath them. In fact, there were currently people going in and out of all of them, and that included the one the young woman had just entered. The surrounding disciples were very excited. Bai Xiaochun looked around and found one particular disciple who looked skinnier and weaker than the others, and sidled up to him. Then, he cried out loudly, "At long last, I can lay eyes on Elder Sister Zhou again. This time she's definitely going to take first place on the 9th stone stele." After that, he turned and asked the skinny guy for more details about what was going on. Considering the young man was in such a good mood, he quickly gave a detailed explanation. Elder Sister Zhou wants to be the first person from ancient times to now to have first place in all 10 stone steles. And she's the only person who could possibly do it. All she has to do is take the test for the 4th and 5th volumes of Spirit Creatures, and she'll definitely take first place in both. Bai Xiaochun decided that the most important thing was to get the 2nd volume of Plants and Vegetation, which meant that he had to go take the test in the appropriate log cabin. If he succeeded, the volume would be his. Therefore, he began to push his way through the crowd to the first stone stele. It wasn't easy, and after he got there, he found that all the cabins were already occupied. After waiting a bit, he saw a crestfallen disciple moping out from one of them, but that didn't discourage him at all. He immediately entered the log cabin. Once inside, it was as if he was completely separated from the cacophony of sound on the outside. Everything here was peaceful and quiet. The log cabin wasn't very large, and in the middle, a prayer mat was laid out in front of a small stone stele. Bai Xiaochun sat down cross-legged in the prescribed fashion, then pulled out the jade slip that contained the first volume of Plants and Vegetation. He placed it up against the stone stele, and it sank down inside. The stone stele shuddered, and began to shine brightly. According to what the elder brother outside said, now is when I'm supposed to decide what insignia will identify me as an apothecary. After thinking for a moment, he chuckled and drew the image of a turtle. He loved turtles, and although his drawing was a bit misshapen and ugly, in his eyes it was pretty good. The turtle insignia flickered a few times, and Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath. He settled his qi and cleared his mind, and his eyes began to shine brightly. Finally, he slowly reached out and put his hand onto the stone stele. In the moment that he touched it, rumbling sounds filled his mind, and his vision swam. When it became clear again, he was no longer in the log cabin, but in an illusory world. Before he could size up his surroundings, light flashed in front of him, and countless medicinal plants appeared, filling his field of view. None of the medicinal plants were intact. Instead, they were broken up into pieces of 10 or more, all of which were scattered about. Just by looking around, it was impossible to tell how many plants there were in total. This testing method of the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion was what countless outer sect disciples of the fragrant cloud peak dreaded. Throughout the years, numerous disciples had taken the test, only to feel completely useless at the end. Because of that, if your name made it into the top 100 on the stone stele, you would be the object of mass envy and approval. That was especially true of the first place spot, which led to total fame. A cold, emotionless voice suddenly rang out. In the time it takes an incense stick to burn, reassemble the spirit plants. Your test results will be based on the total number you put together. You may begin now. That's it, Bai Xiaochun thought. He almost couldn't believe it. He had immersed himself in studying the medicinal plants in the jade slip to the point where even now, he could already spot hundreds of medicinal plant parts that he could piece together. He had been really worried about this test, but now that he saw what it was like, he heaved a sigh of relief. However, he still wasn't completely at ease. It can't be this easy. Considering the test is so simple, the final target to pass must be incredibly high. Once again feeling nervous, he quickly waved his finger through the air, pointing at a dozen or so medicinal plant fragments. Immediately, those fragments pieced themselves together, forming 2 medicinal plants. Next he waved both hands in the air, not even pausing as he sent countless plant fragments flying around and forming together. One medicinal plant after another was formed, until soon he had 100 medicinal plants. He looked up in thought for a moment, and his spirits lifted. Tuning everything else out, he focused completely on the medicinal plant fragments, his hands flying about rapidly. Then, he suddenly thought about how terrible it would be to fail the test, and went all out with even more vicious determination. His eyes were completely bloodshot, and his hands moved even faster. 100 plants, 200 plants, 300 plants, 500 plants, 1,000 plants. Sweat poured down his face, white steam rose from the top of his head, and his hands flew. He looked around, instantly identifying more medicinal plant parts that could be pieced together. Back when he had been memorizing the medicinal plants in the jade slip, he had been so devoted to the process that he had reached the point where he wished he could grind the plants into powder to study them further. However, that wasn't possible, so he could only study them in minute detail until he felt that he understood them completely. If any of the disciples on the outside could see what was happening, they would gasp in disbelief. To them, this test was so terrifying it made the hair on their necks stand up straight. None of them could possibly imagine how thoroughly Bai Xiaochun had researched the medicinal plants in the jade slip. Time passed. 2,000 plants. 3,000 plants. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were completely bloodshot as he forced his hands to follow his train of thought. He even relied on the power of the 4th level of qi condensation, fearful that he wouldn't be able to keep up. Despite how fast he was going, he wasn't sure if he would be able to pass, so all he could do was grit his teeth and keep going. 4,000 plants. 5,000 plants. 6,000 plants. 7,000 plants. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, and there were still some plant fragments left. Suddenly, light began to shine everywhere, and his vision swam. The log cabin came back into view again, and the jade slip appeared on the surface of the stone steel. It was the same slip he had put in before, which contained the first volume of plants and vegetation. I missed a few, but only a few, he thought apprehensively. After picking up the jade slip, he walked out of the log cabin, feeling completely crestfallen. It was at this point that he heard the cheering on the outside. He looked up in the direction of the log cabin Zhou Xinqi had entered. As she walked out, her name suddenly appeared in first place. 1. If you look up this word for magic bottle in the C greater than E dictionaries, it is often defined as Aquarius, the Western constellation. While the term has come to be an accepted translation for Aquarius, the original meaning of the word, especially as it pertains to Shenxia, is a type of bottle used in Buddhist rituals. Ha ha ha, elder sister Zhou did it. Didn't I say she would get another unprecedented first place spot? She definitely deserves to have that plants and vegetation spirit meridian. Her options for the future are endless. Elder sister Zhou, we'll be waiting for you to set another record. When you get first place in all 10, the Great Spirit Stream bell will toll to notify the whole sect. All of the surrounding outer sect disciples were cheering. Although there were a few disgruntled faces to be seen, and a few sharply spoken words, they were drowned out by the overwhelming applause. Zhou Xinqi's position among the disciples here was like the sun within the sky. In fact, she was well regarded by virtually everyone on Fragrant Cloud Peak. Although she was normally quite cold, the applause of the surrounding disciples couldn't help but make her feel a bit pleased with herself, and she smiled slightly. That smile caused the cheering to grow even louder. Bai Xiaochun stood there in the crowd, feeling quite envious of her. Muttering to himself, he looked back at the first stone stele and suddenly, his eyes went wide. Then he looked back down at the jade slip with the first volume of plants and vegetation, and after closer scrutiny, he realized that in addition to the original 10,000 types of plants and vegetation, another 10,000 had been added. His heart suddenly swelled with joy. He then turned his head to look at the first stone stele, and saw that right above the magic bottle insignia was the image of a turtle. Suddenly, he felt wonderful. He had originally planned to leave immediately. But now, filled with excitement, he waited to hear the audience begin to applaud his accomplishment. However, it quickly became apparent that everyone was only paying attention to Zhou Xinqi, and hadn't even noticed what had just occurred. In fact, even Zhou Xinqi was preparing to depart. Bai Xiaochun immediately started getting nervous. Blinking, he suddenly called out in his most astonished voice, "Look! Elder sister Zhou isn't in first place on the first stone stele anymore. Somebody else took her place. Weird, now there's a really cool-looking turtle there. I wonder who drew that." His voice pierced through the cheering, and as people heard the shocking nature of his words, they started to turn around to look at the stone stele. Soon, faces fell, and cries of alarm rang out. That in turn caused more people to spin around in shock. Expressions of disbelief could be seen as more and more people began to stare at the text on the first stone stele. THTH. Somebody actually passed up elder sister Zhou on the first stone stele. That's impossible. Heavens. Somebody surpassed elder sister Zhou, and with that ugly-looking turtle. Who could it be? There's actually somebody who can pose a challenge to elder sister Zhou in terms of skill with plants and vegetation? This is groundbreaking. Elder sister Zhou just took first place on the 9th stone stele, but she still only has a total of 8 first-place positions. Everyone was in an uproar, and the sounds of discussion filled the air. Moments ago, everyone had been cheering Zhou Xinqi, and could not possibly have been prepared for something unexpected like this to happen. Bai Xiaochun stood there in the crowd, so pleased with himself that he almost started laughing. However, he knew that doing so wouldn't be very appropriate, so he held himself back. Instead, he cried out in shock like everyone else around him. Actually, he had never had even the slightest clue that he could actually take first place. It was at this point that Zhou Xinqi, who had just been on the verge of leaving, suddenly trembled where she stood. After hearing the cries echoing out around her, her phoenix-like eyes turned to look at the first stone stele, and she saw the turtle in the first place spot. At first she frowned, but then her expression calmed. In fact, she wasn't even shocked at all. As far as she was concerned, when she had taken first place in the test of the first volume of Plants and Vegetation, it had been just after she was promoted into the outer sect. Back then, she hadn't tried as hard as she could have when she took the test, and that was not to mention the advancement she had made since then. Not bad, she said coolly. It looks like there might be a new rising star in the sect. With that, her body flickered as she shot toward the first stone stele. In her mind, this was a simple matter. The moment someone exceeded her, she would take back what was hers. Her movement immediately caused a ripple of excitement to run through the crowd of disciples. All of them stared in anticipation as Zhou Xinqi walked into the log cabin to take the test for the first volume of Plants and Vegetation. Elder sister Zhou is going to take back the first place spot which rightfully belongs to her. Whichever junior brother drew that turtle seems pretty good. What a pity that he'll only be able to stay in first place for the time it takes an incense stick to burn. Well, that's how it should be. He's definitely chosen when it comes to plants and vegetation. He's just unlucky to have encountered elder sister Zhou. After hearing what everyone was saying, Bai Xiaochun started feeling nervous. Not only had he run out of time, but Zhou Xinqi was simply too famous. Even he himself was starting to think that maybe he belonged in second place. That's fine too, he consoled himself. If I get in second place, then second place it is. Men shouldn't be fighting women anyway. He wanted to leave but couldn't quite make himself do so. He couldn't stop wondering about whether or not he would lose out on what he had just won. Soon, enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, and the name list hadn't changed. Bai Xiaochun was still in first place, and Zhou Xinqi was now walking out from inside the log cabin. Her expression was calm, and she was completely confident, having used 80% of her skill to piece together 4,000 of the total of 10,000 medicinal plants. From her perspective, she had already outclassed all the other naturally gifted disciples. However, as soon as she walked out, she realized that not a sound could be heard. In fact, all eyes were staring at her with strange expressions. There were even looks of shock. She looked around blankly, then turned to inspect the stone stele. It was at this point that she realized that the magic bottle which represented her name was still beneath the ugly turtle. Everything was dead quiet, and all the surrounding disciples, even Bai Xiaochun, were staring with gaping jaws. Bai Xiaochun then looked over at Zhou Xinqi and realized that, other than being quite good-looking, maybe she wasn't that special after all. Zhou Xinqi's eyes narrowed briefly, and then her expression returned to normal. This person really has some talent with plants and vegetation. Now I'm a bit curious to find out who he is. Her body flickered and she once again entered the log cabin. This time, Bai Xiaochun didn't even think about leaving. He stood there in the crowd, holding his breath in anticipation. The surrounding outer sect disciples were no longer discussing the matter in loud voices. Instead, they were whispering in hushed tones, watching the unprecedented scene playing out in front of them. Furthermore, many of them were glancing up at the turtle mark, which now seemed utterly mysterious to them. After enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, Zhou Xinqi emerged once again, and that enigmatic sensation increased. The turtle was still on top. Bai Xiaochun's eyes went wide, and then he cried out in a loud voice to incite the other disciples. Heavens, who is this person? Finally, the crowd, which had been silent up until now, exploded with conversation. Elder sister Zhou tried twice and yet didn't surpass the turtle. How could this be happening? How many medicinal plants did that person complete? Did anybody see which elder brother it was that just took the test? Zhou Xinqi stood beneath the stone stele, frowning. Just now, she had used all the skill she possessed to piece together 6,000 plants. She could never have imagined that she would still be stuck in second place. Her eyes narrowed, and she gave a cold harumph as she spun and walked back into the log cabin, a very serious look in her eyes. After enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, she emerged again, her expression grave. She turned yet again and went back in, and the same amount of time passed before she emerged, face pale. Expression staunch, she once again entered. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. The surrounding cultivators were panting as they watched Zhou Xinqi try over and over again. However, the end result was that everyone lapsed into complete silence. The scene playing out in front of them was terrifying. They could never have possibly imagined that whoever owned the turtle insignia could have pieced together so many medicinal plants, and so thoroughly surpassed Zhou Xinqi. As of that moment, everyone was completely thunderstruck by the turtle. That was especially true of Zhou Xinqi, who once again emerged, her beautiful eyes shot with blood. Everyone in the audience gasped. Bai Xiaochun couldn't help but clear his throat. Right now, he couldn't just blurt out that he was the person in first place. However, the desire to do that very thing itched in his heart like a restless cat. Actually, it was a wonderful feeling. Now's not the time, he thought. I'll find an opportunity in the future to make a big scene in front of everybody. I'll make sure everyone knows that the person who holds the first place spot on the first stone stele is none other than me, Bai Xiaochun. Looking up, he realized that it was getting dark, and yawned, looking like the picture of a lonely hero. With the snap of a finger, Bai Xiaochun, reduced Zhou Xinqi to nothing more than ash. With that, he flicked his sleeve and turned, walking away through the crowd. As he departed, Zhou Xinqi gritted her teeth, and stubbornly entered the log cabin to once again take the test for the first volume of Plants and Vegetation. Eventually, the moon hung high in the sky, and Zhou Xinqi stood there, completely exhausted as she stared up at the turtle. She could never have predicted that a day like this would come, that something like this would happen. The crowds departed, and word of the turtle became the talk of Fragrant Cloud Peak. One would think that the matter was over, but the next day, as the sun shone down onto the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion, the disciples were shocked to see Zhou Xinqi return and once again go into the first stone stele's log cabin. Yet again, she failed, over and over. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. For a full 3 days, she never gave up. Soon, the gossip about the turtle disciple had reached a fever pitch in Fragrant Cloud Peak. There was not a single person who hadn't heard about the matter, and even the inner sect disciples were talking about it. 7 days later, Zhou Xinqi stood beneath the stone stele, staring up listlessly at the turtle. She had tried over and over again during the past 7 days. She had held nothing back, and had even pushed herself to the point of piecing together 7,000 plants. However, she still couldn't surpass that mysterious disciple. "Just who are you?" she murmured. Finally, she took a deep breath, gritted her teeth, and turned to leave. She would no longer attempt to compete over the first stele. However, the image of that turtle was now burned deeply into her psyche. The comfortable life of an outer sect disciple on Fragrant Cloud Peak was great for Bai Xiaochun. Although he missed the delicious food he had access to back in the ovens, everything else was quite satisfactory. In terms of his progress in cultivation, and his research into plants and vegetation, he truly felt as if he was living life to the fullest. The only downside was that his courtyard residence was relatively remote, and there was no one around to chat with, so he got bored sometimes. Could it be that all cultivators are so lonely, he thought, sighing as he stood there in the courtyard looking up into the sky. Somehow, he felt much older and more grown up. The winds of autumn had passed, and snow had begun to fall occasionally, causing the temperature to drop significantly. Snowflakes drifted about in the air, and the spirit winter bamboo in Bai Xiaochun's courtyard was growing strong and healthy. They were now taller than Bai Xiaochun himself, and emerald green in color. They were like a splash of spring in the middle of the winter cold. A month had passed since he had taken first place on the first stone stele of Plants and Vegetation. However, the second volume of Plants and Vegetation was much more difficult than he'd anticipated, causing his research to slow. But that didn't change the most important thing to him, which was that Zhou Xinqi never took back the first place spot on the first stone stele. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun still felt a lot of pressure to be able to piece together all of the incomplete medicinal plants that he hadn't been able to before. "I have an amazing reputation now. I can't let that wench Zhou Xinqi surpass me." From that moment, Bai Xiaochun decided that he would continue to work harder and harder until he reached his secret goal of being able to proudly announce in front of everyone that he was Apothecary Turtle. Although his progress with the second volume of Plants and Vegetation was slow, his cultivation of the Undying Live Forever technique was rapidly nearing the point where he would be able to achieve a full minor circulation. Although the pain only continued to get worse, Bai Xiaochun remained completely focused on the terms undying and live forever. 3 more days. According to the description of the Undying Live Forever technique, in 3 days I'll be able to complete a minor circulation. Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and continued to speed around his courtyard, simultaneously studying the second volume of Plants and Vegetation. The 3 days passed by quickly. On the evening of the 3rd day, it began to snow, covering the Spirit Stream sect in a blanket of shimmering silver. Bai Xiaochun was in the middle of running when a tremor ran through him, and he suddenly stopped in place. The pain that he had been enduring for the past 81 days suddenly vanished. A flow of heat exploded through him, converging on his skin, which felt as if it were broiling in an oven. The snowflakes melted before they could even get near him, instantly transforming into a white mist. It worked, he exclaimed ecstatically, despite his dry throat. Although he felt like he was on fire, when he looked down, he saw a black light flowing over his skin, which circulated around him and then vanished. He then poked his arm with his right hand, and could tell how incredibly tough it was. His eyes shone, and shook his arms and legs a bit. Instantly, he could tell that he was much faster than before. He started to run forward, then let out a cry of shock as he appeared several meters away in the blink of an eye. He could now move twice as fast as he could before. Completely delighted, Bai Xiaochun ran around a bit to test out his new speed, and was very satisfied. Without any further hesitation, he used the undying live forever technique mnemonic to continue practicing cultivation. This new method involved closing his mouth and nose and then attempting to breathe through his skin. An inhalation and exhalation counted as a minor cycle. He needed to practice 81 minor cycles per day for 81 days to complete a minor circulation. If he could accomplish that, then, combined with the painful minor circulation he had already completed, he would have made his initial success in acquiring the undying skin. After practicing a few times, Bai Xiaochun got the knack of it and struggled to get through one minor cycle. Afterward, his body seemed much more gaunt. He also felt incredibly hungry, and gurgling sounds could be heard coming from his stomach. He ignored that, and continued breathing, causing his body to get even skinnier. After breathing in and out 15 times, his body looked like nothing more than a bag of bones. It was as if all the nutrients that existed inside of him had been sucked out of him. However, his skin looked even more resilient than before. Bai Xiaochun couldn't hold on any longer. His vision was fading, and his eyes had turned green from the indescribable hunger which filled him. He was so hungry that he could eat an elephant in a single bite. This isn't working, I'm starving to death. He looked around, salivating, only to realize that there was nothing in the area to eat except for the verdant bamboo he was growing, which at the moment looked quite attractive. Unable to hold back because of the incredible hunger, he sped over to the spirit winter bamboo and took a big bite out of one of them. Crunching sounds could be heard as he ripped out a huge chunk and began to chomp it down. After swallowing, his face twisted, and he shivered from the bitter flavor. Too bitter. I need to eat some real food. He suddenly missed the ovens more than ever. Never before in his life had he ever been this hungry, so hungry that he felt like he was going to faint. His eyes were turning even more green, and he was panting. Finally, he bolted out of the courtyard. Racing down the mountain path at top speed, he would occasionally encounter other outer sect disciples. To them, it felt like a wind was blowing past their bodies, and they turned in shock to stare at Bai Xiaochun running off into the distance. He raced down the mountain, into the servants' district and straight toward the ovens. Not wanting to waste time opening the door, he flew over the main gate. The ovens crew was in the middle of cooking. Now that Big Fatty Zhang and Third Fatty He were gone, Second Fatty Huang had become the leader. He was currently ladling out some rice gruel into a bowl, when suddenly a wind blasted in his face, and the bowl was gone, to be replaced by Bai Xiaochun's gaping mouth. Huh? Second Fatty Huang was startled, and stood there gaping for a moment. Before anybody could say anything, Bai Xiaochun grabbed one of the nearby woks and began to guzzle it down. Apparently that wasn't enough, because he then simply dunked his head into the wok, draining the rice gruel. 1 wok, 2 woks, 3 woks. Bai Xiaochun rapidly drank down 100 woks of gruel. He was like a bottomless pit, and still didn't feel close to being full. Still hungry. This isn't working. I'm so hungry. I need meat. He looked around frantically and quickly caught sight of the mountains of meat that were his elder brothers. The fatties of the ovens stared at Bai Xiaochun in shock. They had seen hungry people before, but had never seen someone this hungry. It was like the ghost of a person who had died from starvation. Then they realized that he was staring at them and salivating. Second Fatty Huang suddenly backed up rapidly, simultaneously shouting, "Ninth Fatty, quickly, there's some spirit food in the kitchen that we prepared for Elder Zhou." Bai Xiaochun's eyes gleamed, and he immediately charged toward the kitchen. Outside, Second Fatty Huang and the others exchanged dismayed glances. Did you see that? That's the fate in store for people who become outer sect disciples. Look at how hungry little junior brother is. You could beat me to death before I agree to become an outer sect disciple. The other fatties were all completely determined to hold fast to their decision, although they felt bad for Bai Xiaochun. At the moment, Bai Xiaochun was doing his best to control himself and abide by the 6 lines of truth from the ovens. He would only nibble the edges and not eat the entire item. After all, if he broke the rules, that could implicate his elder brothers, which was something he would never do. After drinking the gruel and nibbling the edges of the spirit food, Bai Xiaochun's hunger had been reduced a bit. He could deal with it now, so he walked out of the kitchen, wanting to cry but not able to find any tears. This undying live forever technique was far too terrifying. Although he didn't have to deal with any pain now, the hunger was enough to drive a person mad. Second elder brother, he said, looking nervously at second fatty Huang. Seeing that Bai Xiaochun looked normal again, second fatty Huang finally felt relieved. He walked up and patted him on the shoulder in sympathy. Little junior brother, don't worry. Thankfully, we were already preparing some food for Elder Joe. Look at how hungry you are. From now, you come back more often to fill up, alright? Bai Xiaochun was very moved. However, he gritted his teeth and decided that he would do the opposite. After all, one day if he ever reached the point where he lost control, he might end up clearing out the entire ovens. Second fatty Huang and the others escorted him out, and Bai Xiaochun sighed continuously as he trekked back up Fragrant Cloud Peak. All of a sudden, the wonderful, carefree feeling from before was gone, replaced by despair. He really was scared of starving himself to death now. I wonder if there really were some spirit stream sect disciples who died from starvation in the past. I definitely don't want to be the first. Scowling miserably, he was in the middle of trying to figure out how to resolve the food and hunger issue when suddenly he heard a rooster crowing off in the distance. The sound caused him to pause in place and slowly turn his head to stare in the direction of the crowing. Chickens. Looking around to ensure that nobody was watching him, he ducked into a nearby thicket, vanishing with a whoosh. Then he began to slink along like a weasel. Moments later, he appeared outside the fence that surrounded Fragrant Cloud Peak's spirit fowl farm. Inside were a group of chickens strutting around arrogantly, as large as calves, with 3 colored tails. Bai Xiaochun eyed them with glistening eyes, and began to salivate. Meat, he murmured, then began to chuckle, a strange sound that, when coupled with his wide smile, was completely terrifying. Spirit tail chickens were far larger than ordinary chickens. They had very resilient feathers and extremely ferocious temperaments. After reaching full maturity, they were comparable to the second level of qi condensation. Not only was their meat edible, so were their eggs. Their blood and bones could be added to medicines, and when you burned their tails, they could create rare, 3-colored flames. Because of all that, large amounts of spirit tail chickens were being raised in all of the 3 mountains on the south bank of the spirit stream sect. However, they did not actually belong to the sect itself. Instead, they were the personal property of Li Qinghao and the peak lords of the other 2 mountain peaks, who assigned certain disciples to raise them and take care of them. On Fragrant Cloud Peak, there were 3 areas specially set aside to breed them. Bai Xiaochun crouched in the thicket looking at the spirit tail chickens. Back when he had worked in the ovens, he had never seen the chickens alive, but had eaten their meat and knew it was delicious. Furthermore, Big Fatty Zhang had mentioned that they loved to eat spirit bugs. After observing the chickens for a while, Bai Xiaochun flickered into motion. He did not do anything rash, but instead went back down the mountain, where he spent some spirit stones to buy some spirit bugs, after which he returned to his courtyard residence. By the time he got back, he was so hungry that he had to fight not to faint, and immediately began to look around for something to eat. It didn't take long for his gaze to fall upon the spirit winter bamboo, whereupon his eyes began to shine. The bamboo stalks were already around 3 meters tall, and thick as a fist. From the spirit glow they emanated, they seemed far beyond ordinary. Bai Xiaochun immediately hurried over and began to walk around the bamboo stalks, laughing heartily as he studied them closely. Based on what he had studied about plants and vegetation, he was quickly able to identify the toughest among the various stalks, which he cut off at the base and then sliced in half. When it came to stealing chickens, Bai Xiaochun had a very special method. The key lay in the word, steal, itself. Being able to get the chickens without anyone noticing was an art form. He quickly used some of the bamboo to craft a device called a bamboo cicada. He had learned how to make bamboo cicadas from his father when he was young. Supposedly, they were effective in catching all sorts of creatures from chickens to phoenixes. Once the bamboo cicada itself was finished, he used some strips of bamboo to weave a cord. After finishing that, he tested out the cord's strength, tied it to the bamboo cicada, then flew out into the darkness of night. "I'm gonna eat chicken." His stomach grumbled, but his eyes were shining with a green light. Because of how starving he was, he moved even faster than normal, and soon arrived at the spirit tail chicken farm. As he neared, he tiptoed up to the fence, placed a spirit insect onto the bamboo cicada, then threw the bamboo cicada over the fence. Next, he crouched hungrily off to the side, holding the cord, which was attached to the cicada. Further inside the fence were some log cabins, where certain outer sect disciples resided and practiced cultivation. The chicken farm was quite large, with over 100 spirit tail chickens, most of whom were laying on the ground. A few were walking about, occasionally sticking their heads up haughtily and looking around. After a bit of time passed, one of the spirit tail chickens seemed to have noticed something. It turned and looked at something a ways away, then walked over. It immediately saw the spirit insect sitting there, prompting it to peck its beak down to grab it. However, as soon as the spirit tail chicken pecked at the spirit insect, right at the critical moment, the bent piece of bamboo snapped open, ingeniously forcing the chicken's beak open. The spirit tail chicken wanted to cry out, but its beak was stuck open, and it couldn't emit any sounds. Then it tried to close its beak and crush the bamboo, but the bamboo was too resilient, and its efforts were in vain. No matter how the spirit tail chicken struggled, it couldn't make a peep as it was quickly dragged toward the fence, then up and over, straight into Bai Xiaochun's hands. Bai Xiaochun quickly drew upon the power of the 4th level of qi condensation, sending massive amounts of force into his hands, which he used to snap the chicken's neck. Then he tossed it into his bag of holding. From the way he moved, it seemed he was quite a veteran when it came to this sort of thing. The entire affair took only about 30 breaths of time, and most of that time had been spent lying in wait. Were it not for that, it would have been accomplished even faster. Bai Xiaochun raced excitedly back to his courtyard residence, whereupon a fragrant aroma soon filled the air. By dawn, the entire chicken was now in Bai Xiaochun's belly. The only thing left were the feathers and the bones scattered about. After eating the entire spirit tail chicken, most of Bai Xiaochun's hunger was abated. Having replenished his body, he now felt quite warm and comfortable. In fact, he even seemed to have a bit more spiritual energy inside. However, the most apparent change had to do with his undying live forever technique. Bai Xiaochun immediately began to breathe in and out, for roughly 8 cycles. With every inhalation and exhalation, pulsating warmth would spread through his body and then converge on his skin. That in turn caused his skin to become tougher and more resilient. It even flickered with a black light. However, if you looked closely, it was just as fair and clear as before. The undying live forever technique starts with pain, then moves to hunger. This type of cultivation is definitely quite difficult, however, the results are excellent. With that, he extended his right hand, within which appeared his wooden sword. Then, he carefully and softly tapped the blade onto the back of his hand. The wooden sword had a 2-fold spirit enhancement, but when it touched his skin, Bai Xiaochun could sense a faint force of resistance. He ceased any testing, more convinced than ever that he needed to continue cultivating the undying live forever technique. According to the description, the undying skin has 4 stages: iron, bronze, silver, and gold. Right now I've just started. But if I can last for 81 days, I should be able to develop undying iron skin. Bai Xiaochun looked around at the scattered chicken bones, and in his heart, he now realized what was the key to successfully cultivating the undying iron skin. Thankfully, there are plenty of spirit tail chickens on the mountain, he thought, laughing heartily. He was now more interested in the spirit tail chickens than ever. What he didn't know was that in the past 10,000 years in the spirit stream sect, very few people had ever cultivated the undying live forever technique. Most who did ended up quitting during the terrifying torment that was the first 81 days. Although some managed to continue, the main problem after that was how much money it cost to keep going. In order to cultivate the technique all the way to the stage of undying gold skin, the expenditure involved was simply terrifying. Even an entire sect would have a hard time forking over so much. After all, those resources could be used on other, less wasteful techniques. Although those other techniques weren't as marvelous, a sect had to consider what was most cost-effective. That was the main reason why the undying live forever technique had ended up gathering dust in the scripture pavilion. After practicing cultivation for a bit, Bai Xiaochun gathered up the chicken bones and buried them in the nearby spirit soil, along with the feathers. Then he left his courtyard residence and found a place where the outer sect disciples tended to congregate, where he eavesdropped a bit to see if anyone was talking about the chicken being stolen. Based on his experience stealing chickens back in his village, he knew that the most optimal method was to only strike once every few days. After eavesdropping a bit, he didn't hear anyone mention anything about a missing chicken. However, during his eavesdropping, he also learned that the three-colored tail feathers of the spirit tail chickens could be used to kindle three-colored flames. Having learned this, Bai Xiaochun immediately trotted back to his courtyard residence and dug up the three-colored tail feathers out of the spirit soil. Then he sat there, studying them thoughtfully. No wonder they raise so many spirit tail chickens here. He immediately stored the three-colored feathers in his bag of holding. To others, such feathers were nothing more than kindling for three-colored flames. To him, though, they were fuel to perform threefold spirit enhancements. He didn't attempt to do so immediately, though. His plan was to get some spirit medicine first, then perform a spirit enhancement to make the medicine more powerful. After resting for a few days, Bai Xiaochun started getting hungry again one night. He put down the second volume of Plants and Vegetation and headed out into the darkness of night. When he returned, he had 2 more spirit tail chickens in his bag of holding. And that was how time passed by. Soon, a month had gone by, during which time, news about the missing spirit tail chickens began to spread on Fragrant Cloud Peak. Even Li Qinghao heard about the matter. After all, in only a month of time, a few dozen chickens had gone missing from the 3 spirit tail chicken farms. However, Li Qinghao didn't pay much attention to the matter, as he had important affairs to handle which ended up taking him off of the mountain. Most depressed of all were the 7 or 8 outer sect disciples in charge of raising the spirit tail chickens. It wasn't that they cared a lot for the chickens themselves, but rather, that the chickens weren't really theirs to begin with. Although the Peak Lord didn't say anything, they felt the matter to be a big loss of face. After all, whoever was stealing the chickens was doing it right under their noses. However, there was nothing they could do about it. No matter what they did to try to protect the chickens kept going missing. What was most puzzling of all was that the chickens went missing without a trace. Not even a sound could be heard, as if they had vanished into thin air. By now, Bai Xiaochun's body was now completely back to normal, and in fact, he had even gained a bit of weight. However much the undying live forever technique sucked away from him, he would replenish it with chicken meat. His face had a healthy flush, and he was once again living a comfortable life. He was in a wonderful mood, and his belly was full. As a result, his research into the second volume of Plants and Vegetation picked up speed. Eventually, the day arrived when he was finished studying. Based on what had happened last time, he had studied everything in even more minute detail, including the leaves, stems, roots, veins, and even the tiny hairs on the surface of the plants. He was now more confident than ever, and was sure that even if the plants were split into dozens of parts, he would still be able to identify them. Chest puffed out proudly, he strode out of his courtyard residence. This time, I'm going to make sure everybody knows that I am the Lord Turtle who passed up Zhou Xinqi. Filled with anticipation, he headed straight for the 10,000 Medicines Pavilion. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.